Thanks, ladies and gentlemen. It's honestly an honour and a great privilege to speak to you, especially in your 50th year. I realise two things. One is you've just had a lovely lunch and probably want to sleep. And I'm going to show you lots and lots of graphs which will help you go to sleep. But I am going to try and explain why I think they're quite interesting and hopefully helpful to you. But just before I start, I enjoyed listening to the session just before lunch, very much indeed, the PSP and then patient experiences with psoriasis. Now, fortunately, I don't have psoriasis, but I just want you to know that certainly in our unit at the Institute of Dermatology, we absolutely get it and the impact it has on people's quality of life. Consequently, we have a very large we are the biggest psoriasis treatment centre in the UK, and we're multidisciplinary. And we have all kinds of health professionals, not just doctors and nurses, but pharmacists. We work very closely with rheumatologists, and crucially, we have psychologists embedded in our service. And this was not led by me, it was led by others, one of whom is a trustee of yours. And as a result of doing this, we were the British Medical Journal Dermatology Team of the Year in 2016. And we would absolutely love to roll this out more, but it's not cheap. And we are facing a situation now where dermatology services around the UK are not in a great place. And our referral rates are going up by something like 20% per annum. And we just cannot keep up to date with the need that we know out there. And then there's this frightening statistic about the fact that on average, a patient, until they get decent care with psoriasis, might have to wait up to about 9 years in the UK system. And to me, that's one of the most horrific things of all. It's access to care in the first place. Anyway, that's sort of background to that. But I think that things in psoriasis, and you can tell me if I'm wrong about this in a minute, I think that things are kind of heading in not a bad direction. Hopefully, I'm going to be able to persuade you, this is what Helen McAteer wanted me to do, and she's obviously run away knowing I was going to do this, try and tell you that actually genetics is absolutely crucial to knowing more about it. Now, look, we all know that psoriasis is an important disease, and you know it much more than I do, and I know it. And the great thing is actually that the World Health Organization has taken it on board as an important disease, and that means that we can go and bang on doors, not only in the UK but globally, to say, hang on a minute, you're missing this, and this is going to improve access to care not just in the UK but globally, hopefully in the not too many years ahead. So. Why do I harp on about studying genetics? Now, if you look at this horrible immunological diagram here, if I spent the rest of my talk talking about this, you really would go to sleep. And understanding the science and the biology of psoriasis, I'm sure we would all agree, is absolutely crucial if we want to make progress. But this is what an immunologist thinks psoriasis looks like. And it's just too complex. And the problem is everybody has their favorite cytokine, their interleukin, their protein, their cell, their whatever it is. Some things go up. Actually, nearly everything goes up in psoriasis. Some things go down, but not many. And everybody measures something going up and something going down and thinks this must be the most important thing to do with psoriasis. The trouble is you don't know what's the cause and what's the effect. You don't know which is the chicken and which is the egg. And you can tackle that by studying genetics, because genetics tells you what is so-called the causal biology, not just the biological phenomena, but the cause of whatever the problem is in this case psoriasis, that you're studying. And once you understand the causal biology of a process, psoriasis, you're into the primary disease mechanisms. Once you know the disease mechanisms, you can start looking at what the pharma industry calls druggable pathways, which can then inform new drugs, new mechanisms of actions of existing drugs. And I'm going to show you some examples of this in a minute. It'll also help us understand the natural history of the disease. Why is it that some people have got mild disease, some people have got severe disease? Why is it some people have mild disease, then sometimes have severe disease, and it goes back to mild disease again, if you can have mild disease. These are not terms that I invented. Why do some people get psoriatic arthritis and the majority not? What about and you talked, Helen talked about this and others talked about it this morning, what about psoriasis and its association with comorbidities? And I'm going to come back to that again in a minute. The big thing on the government's health agenda at the moment, and it applies to psoriasis, and the UK and the Psoriasis Association are at the very, very forefront of this, is this thing called personalised medicine. So this is all about the right medicine in the right patient at the right time. In order to try and have some sort of rational approach to giving you the right drug at the right time, we need to understand if there are different causes of different people's psoriasis. So this is called stratification. So by phenotype, I mean some people got plant psoriasis, some people got pustular psoriasis, and so on and so on and so on. And this is making a big impact in cancer medicine, as you well know. And the hope is that this will come to inflammatory diseases like rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, inflammatory bowel disease in the very near future. And then, once we understand all the genetics, we can then try and understand environmental factors. And I heard the comments this morning from patients about a streptococcal flare. And so we think that streptococcus can play a role in the acute flares of certain cases of psoriasis. But we don't actually know that. We don't know how it does it. There's theories out there, but we don't know. And the other thing is, your body, did you know that your body contains more bacteria than human cells? So when you're wandering around, more of you is bug than you. And what we don't understand is how the two things interact with each other to cause health and indeed to cause disease. So for an inflammatory bowel disease, which as we know is slightly more common in patients with psoriasis, there is a big interplay between the gut bugs and the gut mucosa, which leads to the disease. In atopic dermatitis or eczema, a skin condition which is not completely dissimilar to psoriasis, it's quite clear that the normal bugs on the skin impact the disease, okay? We don't know about psoriasis yet, but if we knew about the genes, we would then be able to understand how the environment interacts in it. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to walk through epidemiology and genetics. I'm going to highlight HLA, because you've all heard of it. Have you all heard of HLA-CW6 and it's associated with psoriasis? So I'll tell you all about that in a minute. I'm going to talk about how the genetics informs causal mechanisms, as I've said, a bit about drugs, and then I'm going to talk about genetics and comorbidities. The title of my talk was Treatment, Genetics and Treatment, not Genetics and Drugs. So treatment includes lifestyle stuff, and I'm going to tell you a bit about that in a minute. And then hopefully what's next, subject to support from the Psoriasis Association and its research agenda into the future. And just one other very quick point before I say that, is that the things I'm going to tell you about are not just my thoughts, particularly with respect to drug discovery, new drugs for disease, new drugs for psoriasis. The pharmaceutical industry has now, the big guys, are now putting genetics right at the center of drug discovery. So this is the first of several graphs for you. Don't worry too much about it. The key thing is AstraZeneca, big drug company, they looked at all their drugs which worked and their drugs which they had to pull from during drug development, in other words, didn't work. And then they asked the question was, if they had genetic data to support the fact that it worked, would it improve the chances of the drug working? And when they did that, it was almost twice as likely for the drug to work if they had genetics involved in the process. And GSK, GlaxoSmithKline, have also exactly the same data, and they put their money where their mouth is, and they've announced a mega deal with a genetics company called 23andMe, which you may have heard of, because they do direct-to-consumer genetic testing. I'll talk to you about that at the end. But the key thing here is, if I can find it, blah, blah, blah. And the reason they're doing all of this is using human genetics as the basis for discovery, drug discovery. So this is real. Anyway, you can't do any of this unless the disease you're looking at has genetics involved in it. So an important question to ask is, does psoriasis have a genetic component? And to the first person in the modern era, anyway, to look at this seriously, did it in a place on this map. Where?
Finland.
No. No, you're never going to get it. It's there. What's that? It's the Faroe Islands. And so a Danish dermatologist in the early 60s went and knocked on the door of every household in the Faroe Islands. Actually, it was about 50%. I think he got bored. But what he did is he plotted out, he went and looked at everybody, stripped them off and had a look to see who had psoriasis and didn't have psoriasis. And when he did that, he found that there was clustering in certain households. So number one, Copenhagen Street had lots and lots of people with psoriasis, and number two, Copenhagen Street, nobody with psoriasis. And when he did this cluster, it's a classic epidemiological study. He came to the conclusion that psoriasis must have a genetic basis to it. The trouble is that methodology is not very safe because there may be environmental differences in number one, Copenhagen Street, compared with number two. So you need other methods to ensure that the observation that Mr. Lomholtz made is robust. If you let's forget about the thing on the left-hand side, but basically, if your parents have got psoriasis, you're much more likely to get it. But if you look here on the right, this is what's called concordance studies in twins. So if you look at concordance in identical twins, this is people who share all the genes, so 100% identical. If one twin's got psoriasis, it's in about 65 to 70% of patients, the other twin will also have psoriasis. Okay? If you're dizygotic, non-identical, only sharing half the genes, if one twin's got psoriasis, up to 30% of the other twins are likely to have the disease. So if you share all the genes, you're much more likely to both share the condition, in this case psoriasis, okay? And the difference between this and this is hugely powerful evidence that genetics are involved. And in fact, if you do the various mathematical calculations that go with this, far and away the biggest cause of psoriasis is genetics. It's hereditable. Now, it doesn't mean to say your mum and your dad have got to have it, but heredity is the most important thing. Eczema, which everybody thinks is due to food allergies, far and away the most important thing is your genetic profile. And so studying that is going to tell you much more about the disease than studying any other phenomena. So, psoriasis has a genetic basis. So the question then is, how do you go and find the genes that cause the disease? Now, you'll be well aware of diseases like cystic fibrosis and muscular dystrophy, and where a defect in a gene causes the disease 100% of the times. And it follows through a family called Mendelian inheritance. Now, in common problems like psoriasis, that is not the case. It's not that one gene causes psoriasis. It's likely that lots and lots and lots and combinations of it coming together cause the disease. So the reason for putting this very, very boring slide up is to say that in a disease like cystic fibrosis, you've got rare mutations in genes cause the disease, okay? But they are rare conditions. But the effect size is absolute, okay, 100%. So it's very, very high effect, but a very rare phenomenon, goes through a family. In a common disease, common condition like psoriasis, you're looking at common variants that we've all got, even those of us in the room who haven't got psoriasis. We've all got these variations, but you put them together in certain combinations, and then the unfortunate 2, 3, 4% of us it predisposes to cirrhosis. But the key thing for putting this up is that you can even go looking for genes that have a tiny, tiny genetic effect. And the reason you can do that is because of these three gentlemen here. Right, I know you all know who the man in the middle is, Bill Clinton. Who's on the left and who's on the right? Sorry, no, but not bad, but after them. So this guy is called Craig Ventnor, and this guy is called Francis Collins. Now, he was head of the Human Genome Mapping Project, the publicly owned one. And then Craig Ventnor was head of a private human genome mapping project. So when they did the first human genes in around about the year 2000, they sequenced genes, if you remember. The private company sequenced his genome, so it's his. And then the public ones did James Watson's. So the first two genes, human genes, were Mr. Ventnor and James Watson. And the reason for putting that up there is because that to many people seems like a bit of an ethereal project that doesn't impact on their lives. But in terms of research, it's a hugely important thing because as a result of all of that information, you can now go finding genes for hundreds, thousands of conditions that you could never, ever have done before. So it was a mega breakthrough. Anyway, so if you then do that and then you start looking at psoriasis. So here is another graph. This is a graph of which genes associate with psoriasis. So this is a study of around about 30,000 psoriasis patients, some of whom may well be in the room because if you contributed to things like bad beer and BSTOP, and I'll come back to that in a sec, it's quite possible that you help contribute to this. And what this is called a Manhattan plot. And you can see why it's called a Manhattan plot, because you get these skyscrapers. And a skyscraper means that there is a gene there that associates with psoriasis. And the first thing you'll notice is that there's a lot of them. And at the moment, that we think we've identified around about 65 genes that associate with psoriasis. The second thing you'll notice is that some are small and some are very, very tall. Okay? And one is much taller than everything else, and that's this one here. And it's solid because it's just so overwhelmingly strong. And if you look, so guess what that is? That's HLA. So so we've known about HLA being associated with psoriasis since, I think, late 70s, early 80s. But at a genetic level, it's far and away the most important gene. And I'll just tell you a couple of interesting little snippets about HLA. So if you are HLA positive, so this can be done on a blood test, if you're HLA positive, you are 5 times more likely to develop psoriasis. It has a greater genetic susceptibility effect than all the other genes that we've identified put together. So this is the major psoriasis gene. We reckon that in our clinic at St. John's, where we've got thousands of patients, that around about 50% of our patients are positive for CW6. And some are negative, and I'm going to come back to that again in a minute. It's thought about 12% of the general population is CW6 positive. Let's just put it in perspective. It absolutely, and I'm not going to bore you with immunological details, but that's what this picture here is doing. It absolutely tells you that psoriasis is an immunologically mediated disease. This is something going on immunological. It's something to do with your T cells and how they respond to some kind of antigen, whatever that antigen may be. We don't know what the antigen is, but it absolutely tells you that. And the association of HLA-CW6 is different depending on the type of psoriasis that you have. And again, I'll come back to that again in a second. But a very good question that you, as a psoriasis association, might put to people like me is, well, if it is so important, why don't we spend all the money that we're doing on discovery science investigating HLA-CW6? There's 2 reasons. One is it's unbelievably difficult to study for all kinds of boring reasons. And secondly, It's not at the moment something that you can tackle therapeutically. So you can't inhibit HLA-CW6 or whatever like you can other things. So that's the problem with it. It doesn't have a therapeutic or a drug utility, at least at the moment. So while we're waiting for something good to happen with HLA-C, we have to do something else. And the thing is to look at what all these other genes are. So this is the Manhattan plot that I showed you before, with all these different, and all I've done is just annotated. I've just put a label on all of these different genes. I'm sure they mean absolutely nothing to you, but the other thing is it's all over the human genome. And so to try and make sense out of this, I've put them together in a slightly different way. So what I've done here is, these are the genes that were on the last slide, and this is the top 15. So you've had your PSP top 10. This is the psoriasis genetics top 15. And if you do that, here are the genes, so we'll forget about the names because it's boring. But here in the color coding in the middle is what they do. So there's lots and lots of genes, and if I put all 60 up, actually the same rules tend to apply. Is that they're clustering around certain biological pathways. Does that make sense? So there's something going on in the skin, as you might expect. There's a thing called interferon signaling. Now, this is interesting because interferon's involved in immunity against virus, not bacterium, which Streptococcus is a bacterium, so that's interesting. NF-kappa B signaling is part of what's called your innate immune system. This is what gets going as soon as you get sick before your antibodies start to go up and so on. And then this IL-17 and IL-23 is around a particular subset of T cells. And for those of you who know about the biologic treatments, it's already beginning to make sense. And then at the bottom, you've got your antigen processing and presentation, which is where the HLA comes in. And then here is a slightly simplified diagram of psoriasis pathogenesis. And if I then show you, try and signal where these things are going on in the sort of the immunological cartoon of psoriasis, which is over here, you can see that the genetics maps absolutely to the immunology, and it tells you exactly which molecules are driving it. Okay? Does that make sense? Kind of. So here you have, these are the crucial causal biological pathways involved in psoriasis. And what's terribly exciting about this, as you know, as many of you will actually know, is that part of it, sorry, here, this bit down here, is what the drug companies have exploited to develop new drugs. So all these biologics that you hear about, or indeed are on, and I don't know if any of you in the audience are on these medicines, but they are all exploiting this part of the causal biology, the immunology of psoriasis. Does that make sense? So the genes give specificity to the immunological pathways involved in the disease. And then life isn't all about injections. And again, a very, very busy slide here. But I just want to mention this gene called TYK2, which I'm sure no one's ever heard of. TYK2 is involved in antiviral pathways, and it's also involved in T lymphocytes, these interleukin-23 pathways, which the injection treatments. And it's one of the top genes that associates with psoriasis. And there was a really exciting paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in September of last year, showing that an oral, a tablet inhibitor of TYK2 is remarkably effective in the treatment of psoriasis. Almost as effective as the biologic treatments. So here it may well be, and this is in phase 2, so I'm afraid it's not coming to a clinic near you in the near future. But this is a really very exciting development, as an effective, very, very effective tablet treatment. Having said that, we are going to be the major UK centre for clinical trials in this drug. So if you, through the Psoriasis Association, by all means try and contact us, because we will be trying to recruit people to to do this study to try and see if this phenomenon is real. And this, I think, is very, very exciting, and it's all because of the genetics. This came out because of genetics. Right, so I hope I've painted a little bit of a picture about how far, you know, how science with genetics has told us about the biology. And another way of putting this is, you know, in the 50-odd years of the Psoriasis Association, we've gone from hydroxycarbamide and methotrexate, and not much else, to this explosion since the millennium of new drugs, many of which are highly, highly effective. And I thought I'd just illustrate this in a slightly different way than people normally do. And so this is what happened at St. John's when we started using these medicines. So we looked at collectively, and again, one of your trustees did this work. We did this work. We looked at the number of inpatients that we had in patients with severe psoriasis at St. John's, and we compared the number of inpatients before we had access to these treatments, and compared it with how it was after this treatment. Actually, this work was done probably up to 10 years ago now. And you can see that our inpatient episodes, after we introduced these medicines into our practice, dropped by about 80%. 80% reduction in inpatient episodes. Now this, as I say, this data is now 10 years old. Last year, and note we have the largest psoriasis practice in the UK, and I think we've got something in the order of 3,000 patients on our books and rising. We admitted 12 patients with severe psoriasis. 10 of those were new referrals into our system. So patients in our service, only 2 had to be admitted into hospital. A dramatic change. And this is patients, and we still see them in the clinic, who used to spend months of the year with really horrific disease, have just never gone back. And it's a wonderful thing for a healthcare professional to be able to witness that change in practice. But I'm very well aware, as indeed most of us are, that biologics are not the answer to everything. We do know that. They are very, very expensive. The NHS spends £1 billion on 4 drugs, one of which is adalimumab, Humira. So these are awesomely expensive medicines. Most patients have localized disease. This is from your colleagues at the National Psoriasis Foundation in the US. And currently, these medicines are not appropriate for people with more localized problems. Despite their high efficacy, they're not 100% effective in all people. The effect often diminishes with time, and your bad beer showed that better than anybody else. And here, look, there's all the patients responding there, and these are the different drugs. And 3 years later, they're not responding so much anymore. Okay, so things do change with time. Some forms of psoriasis, for example, pustular forms, it doesn't work as well. And of course, you know, these are powerful medicines, and they have adverse events, and we haven't got a complete handle on. So there's a significant unmet need remains, and that's why the research priorities of the Psoriasis Association are completely appropriate, because we need to tackle those issues. Okay, so I just want to change in the last 5 minutes or so. Or have I got about 10 minutes? Can I, Chairman? Can I do is that right? Just change angle very, very slightly to think about comorbidities, because again that came up this morning, and think how can genetics help here? Right. So when you're thinking about comorbidities in psoriasis, you need to think about those that are, if you like, coincidental in the patient population that you're treating, or it may be relating to the treatment, but nevertheless it's important. All those that are disease associated. And we've talked about psoriatic arthritis, metabolic syndrome, and other things as well. The issue around the disease associated comorbidities is which is the chicken and egg again, which again came up. Are they just associated, or does one cause the other, and so on? And when you use the word comorbidity, by the way, if you say a comorbidity of psoriasis, by definition, what you're saying is that the psoriasis is causing it, actually. Otherwise, you shouldn't use the word comorbidity. You should use a term called multimorbidity. In other words, it just so happens the patient's got lots of problems going on. I can rabbit on about that later if you want me to. So the one I just want to pick out to give you an example is obesity. Now, obesity is a big problem. We reckon in our service that something like 70% of patients in our service have a BMI that's a little bit too high than it should be, or a lot too high than it should be. There's some interesting epidemiological work. In red is a study of nurses in America, and basically showing that as weight increases in young females, this is predominantly, the relative risk of developing psoriasis goes up and up and up and up. So if you've got a BMI of 35, you know, that's obviously clinically obese, is you've got a 2.5% chance of developing, you're 2.5, 2.7 times more likely to develop psoriasis, if that makes sense. And even more frightening is if you look at, so this is a study of kids with psoriasis from around the world, is that even children with mild psoriasis, they were this is looking at it the other way around, they're much more likely to be obese. And so there is quite clearly an association between obesity and psoriasis. But the question is, again, which is the chicken and which is the egg? And genetics can answer this for you because it gets rid of all those things that statisticians call confounding variables. It's a much purer experiment because you take out the hypothesis, you just look at the data in an unbiased way, and then you see what it shows you. And when you do that, so basically this is called, the test is called Mendelian Randomization, who cares? But so the thing is that, again, to cut these horrible tables short, is that obesity causes psoriasis. Psoriasis does not cause obesity. So here you have these bars here. Here, you can barely see it, but this is all around 1. Here, it's greater than 1. So it's a method. Obesity contributes to the pathogenesis of psoriasis, or odds ratio of developing psoriasis increases as your BMI increases, and there is no evidence of a causal effect of psoriasis on BMI. So just putting that, so if you're summarizing that, evidence of a causal role of psoriasis, a 10-kilogram increase in weight substantially increases the risk of psoriasis. It's estimated about 20% of psoriasis is attributable to obesity and more severe disease. Not only that, but you're less likely to get a good response to whatever the treatment may be, and weight loss improves outcomes. So you get a better response to treatment, and it's also, in and of itself, likely to reduce disease severity. So we at St. John's have collectively implemented a program called Weight Matters in Psoriasis. Because if obesity causes psoriasis, this means that if you can reduce weight, you would anticipate, you don't need to do a clinical trial, you just get on and do it in the clinic. And that's what we're doing. So we offer all of our patients now who have a high BMI access to this protocol that's agreed with our obesity doctors, with our metabolic doctors, with our bariatric surgeon colleagues, etc., etc., etc. So we are taking this very, very seriously. In the final, I think I'll leave that, sure. In the final minutes, I just want to talk about the fact that not all psoriasis is the same, as I said earlier on. Again, this was on the loop of slides that you had between over lunch, for example. Pustular psoriasis. There is a form of psoriasis called generalized pustular psoriasis, which is a potentially life-threatening episode, as again some of you know. And it's the key thing here is that we call it psoriasis, but genetically it isn't. It's something completely different, because the main gene that causes generalized pustular psoriasis is called interleukin-36. Okay, and interleukin-36 is not a gene that causes psoriasis vulgaris. And that's very interesting, and I won't go on and on about it because I'm out of time, nearly. But the fascinating, and actually the biologics we have don't work so well in this form of psoriasis. So ordinary, but in the New England Journal of Medicine 2 months ago, I think it was, or was it in February, there is a new drug that inhibits interleukin-36. And they've given it to patients with generalized pustular psoriasis. And all of the patients got better. One of them kind of only about 50%. There's only a very, very small study, very, very early. There's only 8 patients treated around the world. Difficult study to do. But they had one injection of this. I think it was intravenous. And 7 of the 8 got nearly completely better. And half a year later, after a single injection, they're still better. Absolutely amazing. Genetics. While that's going on, there is a clinical trial at St. John's which looks around the interleukin-36 pathway in pustular forms of psoriasis, localized pustular forms of psoriasis, hands and feet. And we're desperately trying to recruit. And Helen McAteer knows all about this and has been helping us. But if you are interested, please contact Helen, who can put you in touch with us, or contact us directly. This is a big thing for us, and we're trying to do a clinical trial called Apricot. And if you're interested, let us know, and we'll let you know whether we'll let you know all about it. And if it's appropriate, please come and join us. Right. So last section of slides. UK dermatology, in terms of the genetics and working out what's going on, has made major impacts, in great part thanks to the Psoriasis Association, and thanks to you as patients, because of this thing that you've heard about several times today, called the registry, the British Association of Dermatologists Biologics Intervention Registry. There's round about 16,000 of patients who've been enrolled in this study. And then led by my colleague at St. John's, Professor Catherine Smith, we've been busy collecting blood samples on lots of you. I don't know who, but some of you. And to do genetic studies and to do various other studies, of course with informed consent in a completely anonymized way. And then that that has led into this big grant that several of us around the UK have got, called PSORT, which is funded by the Medical Research Council, to try and find markers that will predict which medicine's best for you. Does that make sense? So, and then we're using all the information from the registry, samples collected from the registry, and then we're analysing it through this research project. And it's a world-leading thing, and you should be very proud of it. 2 little things that have come out of it to date. The first thing is that we can now predict who will do well with adalimumab, with Humira. So in other words, we could do a blood test after 4 weeks of treatment, and we can tell you whether you're going to do well at 6 months or not, because we could do doing the blood level of the drug. So we know what the right drug level is, and we can predict at 4 weeks what you're going to be like at 6 months. That's quite exciting, because as I said earlier on, this is a really expensive medicine, and it may be that you don't need as much of that medicine in some patients. It might mean that other patients need more of it. Do you see what I mean? So in other words, we'll be able to start fiddling around with the dose to get the right dose for the right patient. The second thing is, I said to you that the trouble with HLA is that we can't invent drugs against it at the moment. But what we can do is use it as a marker. If you're positive, what does it mean? If you're negative, what does it mean? Well, it turns out that through bad beer and these sample collection, it turns out that the HLA-CW6 predicts whether you're likely to respond better to adalimumab or ustekinumab, these biologic treatments, Humira versus Stelara. So if you're HLA-CW6 negative, if you're negative, you are about 3 times more likely to respond to Humira than you are to Stelara. If you are HLA-CW6 negative and you have psoriatic arthritis, your skin is 6 times more likely to respond to the Humira compared with the Stelara. Not a bad marker, actually, but this needs to be validated in clinical trials. I'm going to stop there, and just with what's next, there's a lot to do. We only understand about 30% of the genetics of psoriasis at the moment. We need to know more because we know that with direct consumer testing coming, you are going to come to me with a little, you're going to have your a DNA sample which will cost you less than $100, taken from your buccal mucosa, and then you're going to say, am I going to get psoriasis or aren't I? Am I going to respond to that drug or aren't I? And I can't help you at the moment because there's 70% of the genes missing. So we need to find the rest. So there's a lot of work to do, so please don't stop supporting. And finally, the work I've talked to you about is global, it's local, and it's national. There's a lot and lots of grant-giving bodies and organisations involved. People like me end up taking a lot of the credit for this, but just the research nurses, the technicians, the study managers, the databasing people, and most of all you, obviously it's absolutely crucial. And the Psoriasis Association supported and continues to support so much of this work, and I think that you should be justly proud of UK dermatology trying to spend your money well and help. Thank you for your time.